Hi guys. So why don't we go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to thank the National Center for having this event, having me here this afternoon. Some great speakers today, so the bar is high. I hope I don't disappoint. And a shout out, obviously, to Chris James as well. Knew him and have worked with him since my days at the SBA with Chris James. He ran office. I was responsible for the federal government small business set-aside programs. So when you think about the 8A program, HUBZone program, service disabled, women-owned, all those fell under my umbrella office. Did that for a period of 7 years. Prime and subcontracting, mentor-protege joint venture, negotiating goals with agencies, all the various federal small business set-aside programs. So I thought, and first of all, thank you for Chris earlier. Great presentation, a lot of information in there. Thank you. So I'm not going to repeat a lot of that. I have slides. I generally tend to keep them as a guide, but I like to sort of follow the audience and what you guys are interested in hearing and what can be beneficial for you guys. A lot of times we have folks that are just starting off in federal contracting. We have folks that are more mature and are interested in sort of the trends in federal contracting and what's going on in the marketplace. Sometimes we think about, and Chris mentioned this, the mentor-protege program and the joint venture program, which is an excellent way to sort of leverage your partner's experience and yet, build capacity and build past performance. How many folks do we have that are currently federal contractors? Good. Okay, how many 8A companies? Excellent. HUBZone? Pending? Okay. Woman-owned? Okay, and service disabled? Thank you for your service. I know you always hear that, but we really appreciate it. Okay, it looks like we have a lot of firms that are in federal contracting. How many folks have done mentor-protege joint ventures? A few. JVs? Okay. Also, I think what Undersecretary Craven sort of talked about, the infrastructure funds, the trends that he mentioned with sort of the administration and casting a broader net, I think those are really important to sort of talk about and discuss what does that mean for us, right? I mean, a lot of times when I was in government and even after leaving government, we talk and look at a certain policy came out or a certain regulation is going to change. And those updates are good, but what does that mean for a small business government contractor? Before I went to government, my dad had started a federal contracting organization back in the 80s, and I helped run and manage that for about 20 years before I went into the Small Business Administration. And then I was there for 7 years through the Obama administration. So, real quick, I mean, I guess overall, you guys we've talked about this. Many of you are federal contractors, so you know this. Obviously, federal government, largest buyer in the world. If you are in the private sector, leveraging or expanding your portfolio into the federal sector makes a lot of sense, right? 23%, the federal government exceeds the 23%. You have the 5533, which is small disadvantaged 8A, women-owned, service disabled, and HUBZone. How many folks are looking to get 8A certified? Okay, so maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. How many folks have already submitted their application and are waiting? None. Okay. 8A? Okay, good. So, and then the other thing I'll say is I like to keep it conversational, right, and interactive. So feel free to raise your hands, ask questions, keep the discussion going because that's more useful. And Yvette has a microphone in the back. So feel free to raise your hands and keep it conversational. As you guys know, all these programs are now front-end certification programs, right? It used to be women-owned with self-representation. That came into the SBA, and it's full front-end certification. You can get third-party certified, but you still need to do the full front-end certification. HubZone is full front-end certification, 8A, and for service disabled, as you guys are probably aware, it used to be front-end certification at the VA. If you wanted to work with the VA, you had to get front-end certified. That program used to be self-representation for everywhere else across the federal government. That recently changed, and now you have to be front-end certified as an SDV-OSB. That program is being launched by January of this year at the SBA, so it's all being transferred over to the SBA. They just issued a policy with respect to sort of grandfathering folks in for that first year because they're going to get inundated with applications. So beginning January 23, presumably they'll click, the on button on that system, and you can begin getting certified at the SBA. But they've sort of grandfathered folks in to the program. I do want to talk about, and Chris mentioned this, but there's some things on here, even as mature federal contractors, we don't often do. And, again, I used to do federal contracting in my previous days, and a lot of times didn't necessarily focus on data analytics, right? And focusing on marketing. How many folks, especially those of you that are doing federal contracting, look at what used to be a federal procurement data system, which is now USA Spend? How many folks look at that and analyze it to see who's buying what you're selling, as Chris was talking about? Okay, so it's really important. I mean, a lot of folks, especially as you're entering the federal marketplace, the PTAC is a great resource, and we help clients with this as well. A lot of folks will do a shotgun approach, right? It's like, hey, who's the closest base to my facility, or who do I know at a particular agency, or do I have a prime sub relationship and I can leverage that? That's part of the story, right? Because you certainly want to leverage those relationships, that past experience, and those connections. But it's really important to figure out who's buying what you're selling. And Chris was talking about historical data, right? USA Spend, or the underlying data, is actually a federal procurement data system, and it still exists. It's Internet 1.0. It's not very user-friendly. You can use FedMine and other third-party tools. They charge a lot. I'd use USA Spend initially, actually, unless you're generating a lot of revenue and you want to use Bloomberg Government. But it's really important to figure out who's buying what you're selling. And I always give the example of, I always just say widgets, right? Who's buying the most widgets? That can be done by NAICS codes, North American Industry Classification codes. That can be done by product service codes. It can be done by keywords. What we try to do is sort of a combination of all three, right? Because you don't want a whole bunch of noise in there either. But then the question becomes, well, if there's $1 billion at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, right? Let's say I do my analysis, Wright-Patterson comes out first. That's the first slice, right? There could be one contract for $1 billion. That doesn't help me. I'm not going to get a $1 billion contract. So it's really starting to drill down into that and say, okay, where are there a plurality of opportunities of what the government is buying that's relevant to my background and experience? And as you start developing those opportunities, I'd pick 5 or 10. And then it's, how are they buying it? How many folks are on a GSA schedule? Okay, how many folks have a GWAC? Okay, so, and we'll talk about this about trends, right? GWAC, and I throw out acronyms, I apologize. It's, having been in government, you get used to that, but just call me out. Government-wide acquisition vehicles, right? So the federal government is implemented, unfortunately, since when we were in the federal government, category management. And category management meant, let's set up these vehicles, let's buy on volume, let's bring down the prices. Oh yeah, we'll meet our goals, but we'll do it with fewer companies and we'll bring down our prices. We always, when I was at the SBA, objected to that approach because you were now getting your goals by using 10 small businesses as opposed to 1,000. But you need to be aware of how the federal government is buying. So let's say, go back to our example, right? It's Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. There are thousands of opportunities, about $1 million each to get to that billion, if that's the right math. But what if, when you look at it, they're buying off the schedule, the GSA schedule. They're not one-off contracts, right? So then the question is, am I on that schedule? Is it worth it for me to go out and hire someone or figure out how to get on the GSA schedule? Or as you look at it, you might figure out that a lot of the buying happens under one of the government-wide acquisition vehicles or one of the category management vehicles, which is OASIS, Alliant, CIOSP4, one of those. So then the question is, well, how do I get on that vehicle if I don't have it, right? What are the hurdles as a new entrant to be able to get on that vehicle? Or who has that vehicle that I might be a good subcontractor to because I bring some subject matter expertise. I might bring some connections or networks at that particular agency or past performance that's relevant to that prime contractor. So it's really doing the homework and analysis with respect, not just the highest dollar volume, but is there a plurality of opportunities? How are they buying it? And then, are they setting it aside for small business, right? You can analyze, are they friendly for 8A set-asides? Are they friendly for HubZone set-asides? Different buying activities tend to favor one set-aside over another, depending on what they're comfortable with. Obviously, the 8A is sort of always the easy button for contracting officers, especially close to the end of the year. How many folks are familiar or know the distinction between the sole source authority and the 8A program versus all the other socio categories? Okay, a few. So in the 8A program, this is important. Why people think sort of the 8A is the golden ticket, which, by the way, as Chris said, I wouldn't get your 8A until you're ready because it's a 9-year program and you don't want to waste the first 2 years figuring out how to take advantage of it. But the 8A program has a very unique sole source or direct award authority. A contracting officer can basically award directly without competition up to the threshold without writing a justification and approval, right? So $4 million, I think it's 7.5 now for manufacturing. That's very unique. And so they come to the end of the year, they get into the fourth quarter. Government, unfortunately, and I never liked this, they don't spend their money. They're afraid that they're not going to get next year's budget because for whatever reason, the government doesn't say, oh, great work, you saved us money. They say, oh, you didn't spend your budget, we're going to cut your budget for next year. So everybody wants to spend their money at the end of the year, right? So you come through July and get into August and September, contracting officers have a very abbreviated time to award contracts. Sole source is an ideal tool to use at the end of the year. So if you sort of track this at the end of the year, you have significant sole source awards. And it, again, up to $4 million, no justification and approval. In the other socio categories, let's say HubZone, service disabled, woman owned, there are sole source authorities, but they're very different. The contracting officer has to write a justification and it has to be approved by the head of contracting activity. So they can do a sole source. Chris mentioned this, contracting officers are risk averse. They don't want to put their neck out on the line and write a justification and get it approved because they have to prove that this is the only HubZone, this is the only woman-owned, or this is the only service-disabled company that can provide this product or service, right? Now, when I was in government, and even after leaving government, sometimes we'll work with contracting officers to make that justification because technically the contracting officer can be creative, right? They can say, well, this is the only woman-owned small business in this jurisdiction that can provide this product or service. Or this is the only HubZone firm with this past performance that can provide this product or service. So they can be creative, and we've seen some of our clients be really surprised by they were tracking a project, they were the incumbent, they felt they were going to get it, and then all of a sudden it was sole source to a woman-owned small business company. And so it does happen, it can happen, but it's much fewer and far in between as opposed to the 8A sole source awards. And then real quick, as far as anything on this so far? So Chris talked about this, right? So historical data is really important, analyzing it. One thing I didn't mention. So when you start looking at this, right, the historical data, it's not only the prime award opportunities and potentially 8A expiring contract or hub zone expiring contracts, and is the incumbent graduated from the program, so is this low-hanging fruit? It's also an analysis of who your competitors or potential partners are, right? So when we do this, when you look at the widgets being bought at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, you're going to see, who's winning these contracts, what size contracts are they winning, when is it going to expire? Because if you just wait for the awards or opportunities to come out on SAM, 9 out of 10 times you're sort of behind the 8 ball, right? Because your competitors have been tracking this probably for the last 6 to 12 months. And they've probably had conversations with the agency. They've probably met with the buying activity and the contracting officer. They've probably even put their proposal together and their teaming arrangements. So it's really important. It's good to follow SAM, right? You'll see the opportunities come out, but it's really important to track them 6, 12 months ahead of time, and then also look at agency forecasts to sort of develop your pipeline and a strategy for that pipeline, right? Any questions so far?
I did have a question.
Yeah.
The slide before here. The slide before this one, I think Chris mentioned, I'm sorry, that the 3 socio categories, those are negotiable? Is that something that can be influenced?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So yeah, the SBA negotiates goals with agencies every year. Now, the 5533s, generally the SBA will just negotiate those flat out across all the agencies. The 23% is where, depending on what the agency buys, the SBA will negotiate different goals. So when I was responsible for the program, as an example, the Small Business Administration buys a lot of stuff that's small business friendly. So their goal was 74%. Department of Energy, not so much, right? They buy nuclear facilities. Their goal was like 11%. It used to be, and this is something we should bug MBDA about in the Small Business Administration, there used to be a dashboard that was created to track each agency's goal and its performance against that goal on a real-time basis. Now, the scorecard comes out at the end of the year. If you haven't seen it, you can go to SBA scorecard. You'll see each agency's performance and goals. But there used to be a sort of a live tracking, real-time tracking of that, which was really helpful because you could see which agencies were having trouble meeting their goals. The 5533 is across the board, but the 23%, like I think DOD is like, their goal is 21.5%. SBA is 74%, Department of Interior or Department of Labor is like 42%, but it's different from agency to agency. Yeah. Any other questions? No? So how many folks that are current federal contractors go into SAM and the link to Dynamic Small Business Search and update their profiles regularly? Okay, a couple. How many folks are aware that when you have a SAM profile, you also have a Dynamic Small Business Search profile? Okay, a couple. So that's really important. So when you start SAM, right, to get to work with the federal government, it asks you a whole bunch of questions. And a lot of folks don't realize this. When it determines that you're small, it actually opens up a subset of a file for you in Dynamic Small Business Search. GSA doesn't own the Dynamic Small Business Search. It's actually an SBA tool and database. It's important. A lot of folks get done with SAM, and they're like, wow, that was painful. I'm just going to leave this alone till next year. But Dynamic Small Business Search, you can upload past performance, corporate quals, those types of things. And the system of record for contracting officers is dynamic small business search. So we're going to talk about keeping contracting officers and buying activities accountable to going small. But one of the tools that contracting officers use to build up a file for set-asides is DSBS. So if your DSBS profile, dynamic small business search profile, isn't updated regularly, and by the way, our staff tells me that that link is currently broken on SAM and GSA and DSBS, but they'll fix it. And there is a way to get into DSBS through a general login system, GLS SBA system. That's also painful, unfortunately. But contracting officers go to DSBS. We have clients that'll go in, and the other part of it is, it's like Internet 1.0, right? When a contracting officer does a search, the companies that last updated their profile come up first. So we have clients that'll go in and put a little period at the end of a sentence, take out a sentence, do it at least quarterly. But we have some clients that do it even more than that. But it's important to update and make sure you understand what DSBS is and keep it updated. So like if there are searches, and keep it relevant, right? So we've had clients where it was construction work in Fairbanks, and the DSBS search the contracting officer was doing was, is there a construction company that has experience working in this kind of weather and environment? So if they do that search and you don't come up and you really have that experience, they're not gonna call you, right? Any other questions? There is a subnet. We talked about the prime contractors having to subcontract, and a lot of times that's a sort of an entree into the federal marketplace, being a subcontractor. There is a database, subnet, last one on here, and these are available. We'll share these with the group. There is a database that SBA is responsible for. It's called Subnet. It's not updated as much as it usually should be, but prime contractors who are having a tough time meeting their subcontracting goals will go in there and put opportunities. So it's at least worth looking at it or for it. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So just to clarify, when you update, it could mean just changing a word.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it puts you
have
at the top of the list.
Correct. I would encourage you as you go month by month and you have new past performance or capabilities to go ahead and update it so that you come up on relevant searches. But as long as you do a minimal update, it keeps moving you up the search list. That's correct. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about this. The only thing I want to sort of clarify, we've talked about North American Industry Classification Codes. Folks always used to ask me when I was responsible for the program, how can 1,500 employees be small, right? Well, that's ship, I want to make sure I say this right, it's shipbuilding, right? So 1,500 employees in that industry is actually small because most of the companies have like 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 employees. In IT services, 37.5 million is small. In professional services, it used to be 17. I think it just went up to 21.5. So it depends what industry, right? And obviously, when you apply to a certification program, like the 8A program, you have to be small for your primary NAICS code, right? Or the HubZone program. You have to be small for your primary NAICS code. When you bid on an opportunity, every opportunity solicitation has a NAICS code assigned to it. So you have to be small for the NAICS code assigned to that particular opportunity. It used to be a 5-year, it used to be a 3-year look-back period. So average revenues, 3-year look-back period. Congress changed that because sometimes there would be a spike and you'd have a really good year. All of a sudden you're graduating from the small business program. You only had one good year. Then you couldn't pursue set-asides. So Congress worked with industry and actually made it a 5-year look-back period, which was implemented in 2020. And then just this year, if you're employee-based, meaning manufacturing, it used to be a 12-month average. Now it's a 24-month average. The one thing that I'd say on NAICS codes before we go on to the next slide, and you guys tell me if you have any questions. The one thing that I'd say on NAICS codes is oftentimes NAICS codes can be subjective, I guess I'll say. How many folks have had an issue on a NAICS code on a requirement that was released? Yeah, yeah. Because what will happen is it's a little bit subjective, right? It's supposed to be whatever the preponderance of the work is, because not all the work is potentially just one industry. However, contracting officers, and I don't have anything against contracting officers because they have a lot on them, right? However, contracting officers sometimes do what we used to call NAICS shopping, right? So let's figure out, we want a bigger pool of participants or potential bidders, or a smaller pool of participants or potential bidders? Or do I want to make sure someone's in, or do I want to make sure someone's out? And so selectively picking a NAICS code in order to sort of frame the requirement. Now, you can certainly protest, and none of us at our firm are attorneys, by the way, but we've worked on all these programs. You can certainly protest a NAICS code prior to submission of the proposal. However, if you have a NAICS code issue and you feel that legitimately it wasn't selected correctly, I'd reach out, and we'll talk about what a PCR is, a procurement center representative, or I'd reach out to the small business director and express your concern, because they can get involved and sort of talk to the acquisition folks to make sure that an appropriate NAICS code is being selected. One thing I forgot to mention, how many folks, and I apologize, I have a little bit of attention deficit disorder, so if I jump around, bear with me. Stepping one step back. So when you guys do your market research, right, the guys that said, I do federal contracting, how many folks engage with a contracting office once they identify their opportunities? Okay. How many folks do it with a program office? Okay. How many folks do it with a small business specialist that covers the buying activity? Okay. So it's important to do all three, right? A lot of folks will look at the acquisitions and say, hey, I can see who the contracting official is. Well, it's good to know the contracting official, but those guys are just executing a requirement for their customer. Their customer is a program office. The program office has the money, has the budget, they have the requirement, they get the contracting official to execute against it. And the contracting official then follows all the rules, like, wait a second, I have this goal, I have category management goals, so this is the best solution that I'm going to pursue. Oh, by the way, I'm not meeting my 8A goal, so I'm going to set this aside for 8A. So it's important to know your program office target, your contracting office target. But then a lot of folks forget the last leg of the stool, right? Every agency hasn't, well, I shouldn't say every agency. By statute, Small Business Administration doesn't have to have an OSDBU. Every agency has an OSDBU, Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization. Some agencies call it Office of Small Business Programs, right? For larger agencies, you have OSBP, like a DOD. Then you have an OSDBU at Army, Air Force, Navy. And then you even have small business specialists at the buying activities. Now, those guys are responsible for them meeting the goal. And you remember when we said we established goals up here? They all trickle all the way down to the buying activity. Like when we used to establish a goal for DOD, if it was 22%, DOD would say, oh, okay, Navy can't get that high, so you guys go 17. Air Force, you guys can't get that high. You go 20, but Army, you're going to have to hit 30%. So on the average, we'll hit the 22, right? And then those guys filter it down to all their buying activities. And the buying activity has a small business specialist. And that small business specialist is going, wait a second, how am I going to meet these goals? So they're doing industry days, they're doing matchmaking, they're advocating for set-asides. It's important to know who that small bit, once you come up with your top 10 or top 5, it's important to know who the contracting official is. It's important to know who the program office is, but it's really important to know who the small business office is as well. And when are they having industry days? Because then the large primes are there too, trying to meet their subcontracting goals. When are they having matchmaking? Are they going to be at RES? Not to promote RES, but it is a great event. And the National Center, is it in April? Okay, so matchmaking at RES, are they going to be there, right? Do I want to get in front of them? Are there items on the forecast that I want to talk with them about? So it's really important to use all three legs of the stool consistently to sort of pursue the opportunities that are in your pipeline. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I've been trying to get a hold. Jake Long. So I've been trying to get a hold of the small business specialists at military installations in the Carolinas.
Okay.
And they're, at best, an email or a phone number is on the website. All of the phone numbers are no longer in service, and all the emails bounce, or it's somebody who's moved on to another position. How do I find those people?
Great question. So it's important to identify the folks and keep track of all the legs of the stool, right? It's not easy, though. It's sometimes really difficult. So what I would do in that instance is go one layer up in the chain of authority, right? So if we're looking at, and I don't know what the base is, if it's Camp Lejeune or one of those in North Carolina, all of them, yeah. And none of them are responding, I'd go up one level because, I'd go back up to the OSDBU and ask for points of contacts at the bases that you're looking for. And there are always, so the challenge really had been that during the pandemic, there was no in-person events, right? And there was a lot of virtual events. And then there was a lot of changes, and then a lot of things weren't updated. And that's kind of consistent across federal government. But yeah, I would raise it one level to the OSDBU and ask for the points of contact. And sometimes it's really hard because they get, hundreds of emails, right? But being persistent is important. And then the other part of it is, if you're not able to get to them that way, figure out where they're going to be, like at a matchmaking or something, and get to them that way. But yeah, it's sometimes it is hard. I agree. Any other questions? Okay, so how many folks know what the rule of two is? Okay, how many folks know what a PCR is? Okay, so how does set-asides occur, right? And this is really important when we talk about sort of our community keeping government accountable, right? These are sort of tools to make sure that that happens, because there's oversight capacity on buying activities. When we talk about the federal government having a goal of 23% and then the 5533, by the way, we'll talk about the Biden administration's initiative to increase the 8A and small disadvantaged business goal, right? Because they've increased it significantly. But when we talk about all that, there's some oversight mechanisms. The easy one is everything below the simplified acquisition threshold is automatically reserved for small business. Now, that's a good place for the new entrant or smaller firms to get a foothold, right? Because SAP matches SAT. So what does that mean? Simplified acquisition procedures are used for acquisitions below the simplified acquisition threshold. So right now it's 250. It used to be 150. COVID CARES Act raised it, I think, to 750. It's gone back down to 250, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, under the Obama administration, we tried to raise it up to 500,000. For whatever reason, Canada objected. To this day, I still don't know why Canada objected, but the Office of Trade Representative called us up and said, you can't do that. However, this administration is considering raising it up to $1 million. So $1 million would be awesome, right? Because everything below $1 million would be reserved. So I used to not be able to say this, but if you have congressional contacts or the House Small Business Committee or the Senate Small Business Committee, Chris and I talk about this all the time, we should push raising the simplified acquisition threshold to $1 million. Everything below the SAT is reserved for small business. If you're seeing, now, we used to track this, by the way, too. agency by agency. Some agencies are really good. They hit like 93%, 94, 95%. Some agencies are really bad. They hit like 75%. There are reasons why they'll never hit 100%, right? Because I always think about this like a Cisco license. You can get it from Cisco, probably nowhere else, but it's probably under $250,000. So they're going to have to go to Cisco or like Microsoft. So there's reasons why they won't ever hit 100%, but some agencies really do well and some do poorly. But everything below the simplified acquisition threshold is reserved for small business. If you're seeing requirements not get reserved or go other than small, I would raise that. And who do you raise that to? You raise it to the procurement center representative. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But everything below the SAT also follows the simplified acquisition procedures, which means you're newer to the federal procurement landscape. Your procedures that you have to comply to and the process of bidding is also abbreviated. So it's a good place to enter the federal marketplace. So that's the first one. The second one is the rule of two. So the rule of two says that if there are two or more small businesses that can provide the product or service at a reasonable price, not the best price, at a reasonable price, then you shall set it aside. And in government speak, shall means you have to. It's not you may set it aside, it's you shall set it aside. And so it's incumbent on the contracting officer to do market research and to prepare their acquisition file to demonstrate if they're going to set it aside or not. And DSBS is somewhere they go to do their market research. So if they go into DSBS and they say construction, sub-zero weather, and you haven't updated your DSBS profile, they can say, oh, there's no two small businesses, so we're not going to set this aside. Now, who oversees that process? The SBA, and there's another office that I was responsible for, the SBA Procurement Center Representative oversees that process, right? So the PCR works for the SBA. They oversee every buying activity across the country. Now, the challenge is, and there's another thing we can talk to our congressman about, the challenge is that there are tens of thousands of buying activities all around the country. When we were at the SBA, under this particular office, I started with 219 PCRs to cover all the buying activities. When I left, there was 119. Today, there's less than 60. So if you can imagine, less than 60 PCRs covering all the buying activity. And every requirement that doesn't get set aside for small business actually needs the signature of a PCR. It's a Form 2579. Government likes their acronyms and their form numbers. 2579. So what happens a lot of times is, we talked about NAICS shopping, right? What also happens is PCR shopping. So you have a requirement coming out. You don't really want, and I love contracting officers, don't get me wrong, they have hard jobs. But you really don't want this to go set aside. So you get your file ready, your PCR goes on vacation. I don't know where to send it to. I'm going to send it to the PCR out in Guam. And the guy in Guam is so overworked, he's like, I don't know, I'm just signing this off, that guy's on vacation. So if you see requirements not get set aside that you have done a sources sought response to, right? And you guys know what sources sought is, right? If you've done a sources sought response, if you feel that there's competitors that probably did the same, and a requirement doesn't get set aside, I'd encourage you to reach out to the PCR, because the rule of two isn't being followed. And they have a stick in that, so I'll explain that too. But if you go to SBA and do a search for the PCR directory, you will identify every buying activity and the PCR that is responsible for that buying activity. And to the question you had earlier, if you're not getting a response in this instance from the PCR, then their boss is the area director. And so I'd reach out to the area director. And then the area director's boss at headquarters, which is actually around the corner here, is the director of government contracting, GC, at SBA headquarters. So I'd sort of work my way up that chain if we're not seeing set-asides where we think set-asides should occur. And I'd coordinate that, by the way, with the small business specialist that covers that buying activity. So I would reach out to the PCR, I'd CC the small business specialist, I'd give them the history of the sources sought, your responses, and ask why wasn't this set aside? Did you guys really sign off on this? And then the last thing I'll say on this page before I talk about affiliation, I have no idea what time it is, but someone will stop me, right? I have time. Okay, so the last thing I'll say on that page is, I forget. Sources sought, PCS. Oh, the stick. So the stick is the PCR can actually stop the acquisition. So the PCR can file a secretarial appeal. Nobody likes it when that happens because nobody wants especially OMB, Office of Management and Budget. No one wants the SBA administrator having an argument with the Secretary of Defense. However, if the PCR feels that a requirement should have been set aside and the contracting officer doesn't set it aside, they can first file a appeal to the head of contracting activity, and if that doesn't work out, they can appeal the secretary. So it's a secretarial appeal. When I was responsible for the program, we probably did 6 or 7 of those. Now, ultimately, the secretary has the decision. So ultimately, the secretary may talk to the administrator and then say, you know what, I hear you. This is really critical to our mission. We're not going to set it aside. But 9 out of 10 times when it went to the secretary's office and nobody wanted it to, we ended up getting it set aside. So that's sort of the stick that the PCR has to sort of do a secretarial appeal and raise the issue significantly higher. And that's when the acquisition files are really scrutinized with respect to the research that the contracting officer has done. Yes, ma'am.
On the sources sought, is there a time frame? Do they have it on the sources sought when that might become live? And how long are sources sought out in the system for? Could it be a day or
Good question.
month?
So I think generally speaking, sources sought are out for a minimum of 15 days. However, if contracting officers want to limit responses, they also shrink that, right? And so if it's small business unfriendly, that's something you can raise to the PCR as well, unduly restrictive, right? So if the sources sought is time frame unduly restrictive, or if some of the requirements in the sources sought are unduly restrictive, those are things you can raise up to the PCR as well. Yes, sir.
With regard to the simplified acquisition threshold, say for example, an agency wants to purchase a product, the purchase is going to be valued at less than $250,000.
Yep.
I am an authorized dealer for a number of different defense and security related products.
Yep.
I could make the sale of that product to the agency.
Yes.
However, I will not be able to sell it to the government as competitively as the manufacturer itself. But the manufacturer of the product is not a small business.
Right.
What's more important to the government in that case?
Yeah.
To get the cheapest price for the product or to meet their small business goals?
Well, okay, so, yeah.
I'm sorry, because I've been told many, many times,
It's the cheapest
hey,
price.
you'll never get this sale to the government because
Yeah.
they're gonna buy it directly from the manufacturer, and you'll never be able to
Compete.
on the price.
Yeah.
So
That's- That's a really good question. So for those of you in the back that may not have heard that you heard it back there? No, okay. So for those of you that didn't hear it is if you're a representative or a reseller of a product and it's under the $250,000, However, the price that you can offer it to the government may be a little bit higher because of your margins compared to the OEM that would sell it directly to the government. What's the priority of the government? The government always talks about best value, right? And so arguably, small business is the priority under the simplified acquisition threshold. And if they can buy it under the simplified acquisition threshold at a reasonable price. Now, if your margin is 100%, which I doubt if it is, if your margin is 2 or 3%, arguably, small business should be preferred over going outside of small business in that instance.
Okay.
And if it's not, so what I would do in that instance, and I don't know if you've done this and where you've heard that feedback, I would have a discussion directly with that buying activity to see how they're procuring under the simplified acquisition threshold and what their priorities are. They always have, contracting officers always tend to rely or fall back on, oh, well, I'm interested in best value to the government, and now I'm going to have to pay an additional 3%. However, arguably, the small business solution, if it's the same solution, would be preferable because of the simplified acquisition threshold requirements.
Okay, 'cause
Does that make sense?
In the past, I've reached out to the manufacturer to say, hey, there's a solicitation out for it. I'd like to bid it, and they tell me, hey, don't bother.
Because they're going to
We're
compete
already
against you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And they're the manufacturer, and you're
Yeah.
right, I can't compete on the price, but they're not small business and I am. So
Yeah.
how do I
It's so I
navigate
would
that?
I would work with the small business specialist at the buying activity and the acquisition staff. I'll give you an example, right? So there's no clear path to that other than trying to work the three stools that we talked about earlier, right? You got to work with the small business specialist. You got to work with the program office to figure out if they're willing, because of the simplified acquisition threshold, to go through a small business because it's a reasonable price. It's not the best price, right?
Okay.
But I'll give you an example. We worked with a client for the better part of a year to get a requirement set aside where it was Boeing parts, right? We eventually got it set aside because it was ideal for a reseller to sell to the government. There were Boeing parts. They had a relationship with Boeing. It could easily be set aside. Once it got set aside, and this isn't to throw Boeing under the bus, but Boeing called the acquisition buying activity and said, we're not going to sell this to a small business. And they said, well, what do you mean? You already have a relationship with these guys. I said, no, you know what? We like dealing directly with the government. So guess what? The government pulled that requirement out of the small business set-aside program.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
it's you can work
Experience
that as well.
similar
Yeah.
to that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'm Dawn Hool. I'm the owner of Sunsinger Consulting. So I do business development for tribes.
Awesome.
The one thing I guess I would offer when you're talking about sources sought, I had a client that responded and the government didn't know what they really wanted. And so I responded with 8 additional questions clarifying, is this really what they wanted? And then the contracting officer said, oh, no, this is not what we wanted. They pulled it until the next quarter, so then they could get their act together and really understand what they wanted. Because when you're doing new projects, especially on tribal lands or national parks or whatever the project was, sometimes they don't know. And so they're making it up using some older
Requirements.
1900 stuff. I was like, where did she find this language? So push back. I mean, and you can, you know, very kindly say, hey, here's 5 or 6 things to consider. Is this the direction you wanted to go in your sources sought? I mean, and that's how I got the conversation going. So it at least puts you, 1, in the driver's seat, and 2, I guarantee I'm getting that contract when she reposts it because I rewrote her scope of work.
Yeah.
I mean, I wrote it, I responded to the point that she just had to copy and paste and created a scope of work for my company, so, or my client's company, so.
Yeah. No, that's perfect. So
I make it easy for the government.
that's, yeah. Well, that's, I mean, when you think about sort of making it as easy as possible for the government, right? Like even when you apply to the 8A program or the Hub Zone program, answering the And a lot of folks are like, well, they got to figure it out. It's in there somewhere. It's make it dummy proof. Make it as easy as possible for the government. And responses to RFIs as well, like requests for information. Like if you know better, because you're right, they're putting requirements together where a lot of times it's cut and paste. And we did something similar to this before. Let's just put this out there and see what kind of responses we get. If it's an opportunity to educate the contracting officer, then it makes you stand out. Great comment. Thank you. Any other questions right now? All right. Yes. Yeah.
The sources sought in RFIs, they don't follow the same parameters as RFPs. So I've turned them in late, and I've got, thank you, you're part of the deal. So I wouldn't say you're not connected to that. I know that you're not, because RFPs have a different mandate as far as timelines.
Yeah, I mean, look, so I think that's contracting officer by contracting officer. I wouldn't encourage you to miss the deadline, but if you do, you may want to go ahead and submit something. But you're right, there's different rules for RFIs and sources sought as opposed to procurements, RFPs, and responses to solicitations. How many folks? Yes, sir.
I'm curious about the Buy Indian Act. There's a lot of hype going on about that, and you haven't mentioned that, or you may have. I may have missed
No,
that,
I haven't yet, but that's
and how does that come into play? Because it seems like they're brushing off. There's a lot of hype, especially IHS.
Yep.
But I just don't see work going to Native-owned companies.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So the couple of things I'll say about the Buy Indian Act. How many folks, how many Native entity owned, in other words, owned by a tribe or a Native Hawaiian organization or an Alaska Native Corporation do we have here? Oh, good. Okay. How many individually owned tribal entities do we have here, like owned by an individual? Okay, great point. So Buy Indian Act was revised and updated and released recently. Department of Interior and Indian Health Services, it's kind of like almost like the VA and Vets First. So they have to look to go Native owned first. Department of Interior, so there's a lot of opportunities, and you know when you look at sources sought or when you look at SAM, they're specifically set aside for Native-owned enterprises, right? And with the infrastructure funds coming out, a lot of it is going to go through Department of Interior and IHS and Bureau of Land and Management. Now, Department of Interior has said that they are thinking about expanding Buy Indian to all their procurements, right? And not just, but that hasn't been finalized. But that's definitely, and that's very similar to the set-asides, but it's unique right now to IHS and Indian Services at Department of Interior. But it's like VA and Vets First. And set-asides occur, and there were some clarifications on sole source awards under Buy Indian as well. The one thing that I'd say is that the challenge for us, and I know this has been a discussion in the community for decades, the challenge for us is that in the 8A program, where state-recognized tribes can qualify for the 8A program, at the Department of Interior and Buy Indian Act, it's federally recognized tribes that are recognized. And so that's a little bit of a challenge. We had a client that unfortunately lost out on an award because of that not too long ago. Yes, ma'am.
What if a tribe is actually federally recognized, does not receive any federal funds, and no land is owned by federal government?
If it's federally recognized, it's okay for the Buy Indian Act. But you know, it has to be in the register of federally recognized tribes, right? As long as you have that and can point to that, then it should be okay for Buy Indian, and for that matter, the 8A program. Okay. At the, yeah.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. You can do
Sorry,
it.
John, to take over
No,
your.
no, go for it. Go for it. I like
But
the
if you're
discussion.
if you're new to it, there's an actual registration to be listed on their vendor system, and we are talking about BIA. So, and I'm not, I'm not being kind. Follow up. I have applied for all of my clients to make sure I was on their list, and then somebody got fired, moved, transferred, whatever, or didn't do their job. Make sure you're on that list and it's a spreadsheet. I mean, it's really nothing miracle.
It's not like a front-end
it's-
certification program like the
God,
8A
no,
program.
It's just a
right.
spreadsheet. But you fill it out, you make sure that whoever the new person is, and your business is on the list. And it's really easy once you get them to do their job, but
I think there was one more question.
You had a question about the Buy Indian Act and subcontracting limitations. Has that
Yeah.
changed? I feel like
No.
in terms of at one time, I think you had to have native-owned businesses, a certain percentage of
Yeah, so it's
subcontractors.
similar to so we haven't talked about this, but it's similar to the performance of work requirements on a set-aside, right? So let's say you're a woman-owned small business and you get a woman-owned, now this is a good question because I don't think similarly situated applies to them. But let's say you're a woman-owned small business and you get a woman-owned small business set-aside, right? For those of you that are in federal contracting, you know that the prime is supposed to do 50% of the work, right? Because there's limitations on subcontracting. You got the set-aside. They don't want you to do 1% and then subcontract 99% to Lockheed, for example. So there are limitations on subcontracting. There is the rule which is similarly situated, meaning if your subcontractors are similarly situated, in this case, a woman-owned small business, then together you can count towards that 50%. I don't think that's applicable to the BIA, but I can check on that. That's a good question. Okay. Any other questions? It is applicable to BIA, the similarly situated?
Yep, by Indian Act,
Okay.
it's the Indian economic enterprise has to do at least 50% of the work, but if you're two Indian economic enterprises, it's 100%.
So is it follow the similarly situated rule from the SBA, or is that their internal
No,
rule?
it's a straight, it's
their
straight just
internal rule.
IEE, or if it is set aside to ISBEE, and that's where it could get sticky.
Because you both have to be.
IEE, Indian Economic Enterprise, isn't necessarily small.
Yeah.
But to meet the SAT, BIA and IHS put out contracts that are for ISBEE. Then you have to make sure that you're both ISBEE if you're going to, if you're going to have a sub do more than 50%.
Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But remember, if you're going together on it together, it would probably be smart to have a joint venture agreement.
And we'll talk about joint ventures. Yep. Any other questions so far? How many folks, especially those that are in federal contracting, are familiar with the term affiliation? Okay, a couple. Okay, so this is important, and I don't bring this up sort of to scare folks, but it's really important to be aware of because you're subject to protest, right? Affiliation can occur. So we talked about small business. You have to be small for your NAICS code that you apply under. You have to be small for your primary NAICS code. Affiliation can occur. So for us, or those folks that are familiar or comfortable in the private sector world, there are all sorts of things you do. Let's say you have common management, or let's say you have common facilities, or common owners. Let's say you do a whole bunch of joint ventures together with one company over and over and over again. One of my favorite ones is, and when I was at the SBA, folks would tell me, don't tell that story. One of my favorites is when I was in federal contracting. I mentioned, my dad had a firm. We used to do professional services. A lot of times we'd go after small business set-aside contracts, right? Now, we talked about doing 50% of the work. I was like, yeah, we can do 50% of the work. But we had like a Deloitte, or at the time, like an Arthur Andersen as a subcontractor. And I'd say, yeah, we'll do 50%, but you know what? They can find the staff, they can write the proposal, they can help us manage it. At some point, that's going to be called ostensible subcontracting. It means that you're overly reliant on a subcontractor. So that's also affiliation. So what SBA is going to say, affiliation in and of itself isn't a bad thing, right? They can find you affiliated with another small firm. They can find you affiliated with a large firm. But what they'll do is, if you get a size protest, they're going to combine your revenues to determine if you're still small. Now, in our case, if someone would have protested and say, wait a second, you're unduly reliant on your subcontractor, they would have combined the revenues, and guess what? We wouldn't have been small anymore, so we would have gotten kicked out of that requirement. So affiliation is important to be aware of. Like, for example, and we'll talk about mentor-protege and joint ventures, and I know we're coming up to half an hour. We'll talk about mentor-protege and joint venture because they're really unique tools to be able to excel in this current marketplace. But you can do a small-to-small joint venture, right? And remember, I apologize, I said I'd jump all over the place. I'm going to do one of those. You can do a small-to-small joint venture. And remember the 51% owner of that joint venture, the size and status flow from the 51% owner. So let's say you're a woman-owned and you have a partner that's an 8A, maybe even a tribal 8A, right? You could do a joint venture and the 51% owner's status flows to that joint venture. So all of a sudden now, you have a joint venture entity, it's a legal entity, 51% owned by the tribal small business, it's a tribal 8A. It can go after unlimited sole source, right? It's small to small. Now, if you did JV number 2, and then JV number 3, and a huge source of your revenues were coming from those JVs, you get protested, the SBA is going to say, you guys are affiliated. And now they're going to combine your revenues. Now you might be other than small. Now you're going to not only get not that contract, but you're going to be on DSBS as other than small until you fix your problems and go back and ask for a review of your size. So that's one. Another one I'll just throw out there, again, something that doesn't often come to people's mind, is if you have one source of revenue, right? So when I was at the SBA, we were encouraging folks to come in and get 8A certified, right? There was an STVOSB, had done work as a service-disabled veteran for a long time, had been pretty successful. Came in, went to the 8A office, they looked at his application, they said, oh, well, wait a second, 90% of your revenues are coming from one source. Sent it over to the size office. The size office said, oh, wait a second, you're other than small. You're not getting 8A certified. But guess what? You're no longer small or STVOSB either. So the firm came into the SBA hoping to get 8A certified. They left the SBA getting all their certifications and their small business size decertified, so to say. So it's just something to be aware of and cautious with respect to affiliation. Not to scare you, but a lot of times you'll have like common ownership, common management, common facilities, brothers and sisters in the same industry. You just want to be aware of that. What we always tell our clients is keep it as, business is ugly, right? You're going to do joint ventures. You're going to have common management potentially. You're going to have prime sub relationships. Keep it as clean as possible. Business is ugly, but try to keep it as clean as possible in case of a size protest. And you know, you can self-represent with a clear conscience as long as, in your opinion, you're meeting all those requirements. Never self-represent knowingly something that's false, right? Because that's when you're going to start getting in trouble. But those are just certain things to be aware of. Any questions? No? Okay. So, oh, yes, ma'am.
Thanks. So is that a suggestion to hire an attorney?
Depends. I don't want to encourage spending a lot of money, right? But it's important to know when to ask the right questions, right? So I'm not saying you have to have, if you have a messy situation where you have a lot of common ownership or common management, then yeah, I would probably want an attorney or an advisor to look at that and write an opinion on it. Make sense? Yeah. Okay. So how many folks are currently in the 8A program? How many folks are looking to get in the 8A program? Okay, we'll do this real quick because I do want to get to mentor protege. So the 8A program, obviously we've talked about the unique ability to get sole source awards, right? Tribes have additional unique abilities because they can have an unlimited number of 8As, and they can strategize that and have them in multiple industries. And their sole source cap is unlimited. They have to write a justification and approval, or the contracting officer has to write a justification and approval at $25 million for civilian agencies and $100 million at the DoD. So they really have access to unlimited sole source opportunities. Yes, sir.
How often do those sole source awards hit those caps?
So that's a really good question. So it used to be, and this happened at 2000, so it used to be no justification and approval was ever even needed, and before 2010. And so Congress was like, well, that's a lot of sole source. I mean, there was some $100 million, $200 million contracts going to tribal 8As. In 2010, I think it was the 2010 Jobs Act, the JNA was implemented, and we saw what we called sort of a chilling effect. So those above 100, or at the time, they're both civilian and DoD was at 20, and then it went up to 22 and a half, then it went up to 25. So there was a chilling effect. But, we see, there isn't like tons of them, but we see 20 million tribal contract, $30 million tribal contracts. We've seen some $110 million tribal contracts. So, but that'll mean that subsidiary isn't going to remain small for that long. But that's the thing with tribes, right? You can early graduate or voluntarily withdraw from the 8A program, but then you can have 8A number 2, 8A number 3, et cetera. So yes, those do happen. When I was at the SBA, we used to do sort of a study of how many contracts are sort of the entity-owned firms getting and how much, as opposed to all the other firms. And it wasn't, it was significant, but it wasn't, detrimental to the program significant. And by the way, the one thing that I'd say is, and I used to get this question all the time, oh, it's not fair, they get unlimited sole source, they can have multiple 8As. But the one thing I would always say is, you got to understand it's a program for an entire community. It's not a program for an individual. The 8A individual program is for one person. These programs are for an entire community. So yes, do we want to make sure that the benefits flow to the intended community? Yes. Do we want to make sure that it's, to the extent possible, a sort of a fair level playing field? Yes. But the 8A program for tribes, NHOs, and Alaska Native corporations is unique and different. It supports entire communities. And then the last thing I'd say is that the Hill has looked at this about increasing potentially the sole source threshold for individual 8As. So it's been $4 million for quite some time. At one point, there was discussion and even made it in a bill to raise it up to $20 million. There was a lot of pushback from the Native community and the Alaska Native community because that would really be too competitive with where they play. And again, quite frankly, those programs support entire communities. The thought process now is, does doubling it make sense? So instead of the 4 million threshold, does 8 million make sense? So it hasn't been quote unquote right-sized for a long time. Does it make sense to right-size it? Any questions so far about what I mentioned on the 8A program? Okay, so for those of you that are in the program, it's a socially and economically disadvantaged program, right? So you have to meet socially disadvantaged. They are the presumed categories, Native American, Hispanic American, African American, Asian Island Pacific Islander. And then there are, you can get into the 8A program by the preponderance of the evidence. So we had, when I was running the program, and we have clients that do this too, is if you're a Caucasian female, right, but you're in the construction industry or the IT industry, you can demonstrate by the preponderance of the evidence that you've been discriminated against in your industry. And it's not enough to say, hey, I was discriminated. You kind of have to connect the dots, right? I was discriminated and it prevented me from getting a proper education, or I couldn't get financing for my business, or I didn't get a promotion, or my business didn't get the jobs that others would have. So you have to be able to connect those dots to prevail. The one thing that I'd say about sort of the current environment in the 8A program, there is a backlog, right, at the agency. And now you're bringing the CVE program in, and Jackson will be here. I'm sure he'll speak to it. Great guy, great agency. I love their mission, but they keep getting more work thrown at them without any additional budget. So there is a backlog. Now they're bringing the CVE over, and that's just going to create more of a backlog. You have the Women-Owned Small Business Program that has a backlog. So it's a challenge. However, now is an ideal time because, as the Undersecretary said, there's a significant push to throw in and cast a broader net, right? So they're looking to increase a number of 8A companies in the portfolio. They're looking to make sure that the companies exist to meet the increased goals. The goals went from 5% to 11% last year when we talk about 8A small disadvantaged business. Now, 11% was a little bit of a cheating, right? Because even though the goal was 5% for 8A small disadvantaged business, the federal government usually hit 10 or 11% when it comes to 8A and small disadvantaged. Why? Because that's the easy button. But now that it's going to increase to 12 or 13% this year, 14% next year, and 15% by 2024, now you're thinking about, wait a second, do we have enough companies to help the federal government meet these goals? So one, obviously, tribal entities become very attractive because you can give them a large sole source and you can hit your goals. And then, obviously, the more firms you have in the portfolio, the better. So now is a good time, actually, to be looking at these programs and applying to these programs. So we talked about socially disadvantaged. Economically disadvantaged, if you're an individual, you have certain thresholds. You have your AGI, average gross income, has to be less than 350. Your net worth has to be less than 750,000, and your total assets has to be less than 7 million. Now, net assets, you take out your primary residence, your business that's applying, and your retirement accounts, right? So is that below 750? When you look at total assets, you throw that all back in, you can still, and this was a recent update in the rules, you can still exclude your retirement. Is that above 7 million? So if you can meet those thresholds as far as economic disadvantage and you're socially disadvantaged, you can look to apply to the 8A program. It is a front-end onerous certification program. They're going to look to make sure that the disadvantaged individual owns and controls. Controls means, yes, you own 51%, but it also means that your minority partner can't overrule you in any instance. There can't be any unanimous consent provisions, or I should say, there can only be unanimous consent provisions in extraordinary circumstances. So your minority partner shouldn't be able to control day-to-day. Your minority partner shouldn't be able to set strategic vision. For unanimous consent provisions, they should be limited to extraordinary events like dissolution of the company, filing a lawsuit, adding a new member. There are 4 of them that SBA generally allows. So ownership and control by the disadvantaged individual is critical. The social disadvantage, obviously we talked about, economic disadvantaged thresholds are critical. Chris mentioned this. You don't want to get into the 8A program until you're ready. You want to be able to take advantage of the sole source opportunities because come year 4, then you go into the transition phase in 6, 7, 8, or is it 7, 8, and 9? You're going to get weaned off sole source. You're going to get weaned off 8A work. You're going to have what they call BAT, another acronym that I love, business activity targets. And you're going to have to make thresholds that shows you're less and less reliant on the 8A set-asides and sole source. So you want to hit the ground running, and you want to be able to take advantage of those sole source opportunities in the first several years to grow your company. Any questions on the 8A program? Yes, sir.
Just on a timeline, you said everybody's backlogged now. Once my application's in and it's been accepted, what's the timeline running for?
So the question was generally what are we seeing with respect to timelines at the SBA for applications? So when you first throw it over the fence technically they have 15 days to accept it for processing, right? Which a lot of times they'll come back and forth. The clock stops every time they come and ask you a question. So generally that first 15 days actually takes about a month. So that's a month right there. So then once they're satisfied with your answers and you have a complete package ready for analysis, it says accepted for processing. They're supposed to have 90 days. Generally, they're running closer to 110 days, right? So, and that's with a clean application. Let's say you don't have a whole bunch of minority owners. It's not a first-time tribal application. So, okay, it's a real clean application. I'd say at least 3 to 4 months. But every time they come back with a question, the clock stops. So it's incumbent on you to be really quick and responsive with respect to the questions they ask. Yeah, yeah. Any other questions?
6 months is a realistic.
Yes, once it's accepted for processing. So a lot of folks don't know the screening process versus accepted for processing. So initially it goes through screening, then you'll get a notice accepted for processing. Once it gets into that hurdle, I'd say 4 months. Okay?
Better than I expected.
Yeah, well.
That's good.
But CVE isn't over yet, so in January it'll come over, so we'll see. Did you have a question? No?
John, what is CBE?
Oh, CVE, good question. I'm not going to tell you what the acronym means, but it is the certification process at the VA for service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses that are coming over to the SBA. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Certified Veteran Enterprises. Any other questions? 8A real quick. Hub zone. So as one thing we didn't mention, contracting officers get multiple credit. So a lot of folks don't realize this, right? They think $1 million contract, it's got to fall in a bucket. Is it going to fall in the small business bucket, in the 8A bucket, in the hub zone bucket? Guess what? If you have all those certifications, they get quadruple credit. It falls in all the buckets. So they cannot do a quadruple set aside. And the new regs that just came out this past October clarified that you can't do a double set aside. However, they can get quadruple credit. So it makes you more attractive if you can say you're 8A certified, but you're hub zone and service disabled and women owned because they get quadruple credit. So 10 minutes? Oh, okay. So if you can qualify for the hub zone program, I'd encourage you to do so. How many tribal entities do we have here? Are you guys hub zone certified? All of you? You're not? Okay, you're not? Okay. So it's important to, especially for hub zone, especially for tribally owned entities, and I'll tell you why. We have a lot of tribal clients. You may never do a hub zone contract, and tribes can qualify through an exception. So where a small business has to have their principal office in a hub zone, principal office is just where your most number of employees work. It's not your headquarters. Where you have to have your principal office in a hub zone and 35% of your employees working in a hub zone, any hub zone, but in a hub zone. Tribes can get into the program by saying, I'm not going to do that. But if I win a hub zone contract, 35% of the staff on that contract is going to come from our hub zone community, meaning tribal land or areas surrounding the tribal land, right? So they can get in through the exception. Once you get in through the exception, you may never do a hub zone contract, right? But guess what? When you're awarded a $100 million 8A contract, sole source, the agency is going to get a $100 million hub zone credit as well. So it just makes you more attractive if you can say you're hub zone certified as well. That's important. I'm going to jump real quick into mentor, protege, and joint venture because I know I have limited time, but it's really important. So as we've seen, and we talked about the federal government marketplace, it's more competitive. There's these larger government-wide acquisition vehicles. Sometimes it's hard for newer entrant small businesses to participate in that marketplace, right? Used to be mentor protege was only in the 8A program, right? And in the 8A program, it did so well, the Hill looked at it and said, well, wait a second, why don't we extend it to all small businesses? So you can team up with a mentor, right? And you can't say I'm going to team up with this mentor, and the only thing I want to do is go after set-aside contracts. Because SBA is going to look at that application and say, this is not just to go after set-aside contracts. So it's important to have benefits flowing from mentor to protege. It's important to do a gap analysis. What am I missing as a protege? You only get 2 mentors in your entire lifetime, ever, for your company. So it's important to do a gap analysis saying, you know, I'm missing business development capacity, project implementation capacity, HR, internal capacities, financial capacity. You got to do that gap analysis and make sure that those are the benefits flowing from mentor to protege, because you only ever get 2. A mentor can have 3 proteges, and a mentor can be a large business, it can be a graduating small business, you can be a mentor and a protege at the same time, but you want to make sure that your mentor can definitely provide some of those benefits to you over the 6-year life of that MPA. It's 3 plus 3, right? When we are advising a protege, we say be very specific. Write down, and it's a template, right? The really important part is the chart. Write down in that chart what you want from that mentor. What are you going to get? Who's going to provide it? How are they going to provide it? When are they going to provide it? Be very specific. When we are advising the mentor, and this isn't, a lot of times we advise both. We say, you want to be a little bit fuzzy and feel good, because you're going to have to report on this every year. You want to make sure it's something that you can deliver against, right? So make it something that's concrete enough, but something that you can definitely deliver against. It's 3, and it's extendable to an additional 3 years. Generally it happens automatically, but if the mentor isn't performing, then it might not be extended for that additional 3 years. So that's the mentor-protege relationship. Under the mentor-protege relationship, you can create a joint venture. Why is that important? Because remember, we talked about the joint venture inheriting the past performance and quals of both members. So if your mentor is Lockheed, you create a joint venture. Let's say you're a Tribal 8A. You create a joint venture. The Tribal 8A owns 51%. Lockheed owns 49%. Lockheed can do up to 60% of that project because of the mentor-protege rules. Not 50, they can do up to 60. That JV inherits the Tribal 8A designation, but it has all the past performance, corporate quals of both members. So now you have a Tribal 8A with Lockheed's past performance, and you can go after unlimited sole source, right? So it's a really effective tool for small businesses, more nascent businesses, to team up with someone more experienced to go after set-aside contracts. Before this, Lockheed couldn't go after a set-aside contract, right? Now they can go after an unlimited sole source and do up to 60% of it. Yes, sir.
Just to clarify, you said that a mentor can have up to 3 proteges. Yeah. Is that at one time? Yeah. Okay, so, all right.
Yeah, good question. So a protege can only have 2 mentors in their entire lifetime, so you got to be really careful. A mentor can have 3 proteges at any given time, so they can roll in and out. But here's the thing. All of Lockheed, with all its subsidiaries and everything else, can only have 3 proteges, right? So they are also very selective. You want to be selective, right? You want to be selective, but they're also going to be very selective. And quite frankly, when you create that joint venture, the protege has to be in the driver's seat. So when we talked about ownership and control from the disadvantaged individual, when you looked at the 8A company, in a joint venture, it's a legal entity, 5149, right? The protege has to be in the driver's seat. You can't have unanimous consent provisions where Lockheed can overrule the protege. So they are very cognizant of and careful on who they partner with and how those joint ventures are created. But it's an incredible tool. So what we see oftentimes is that these joint ventures continuously win the OASIS, the CIOSP4, the Alliance, all those larger vehicles, because they're very competitive. Now, the one thing that I'll say is that those joint ventures, because they're winning a lot, they're also getting protested a lot. So if you don't follow all the rules in setting up the joint venture, if you don't ensure that the protege really owns and controls, you're going to get protested and you'll probably not prevail. And then you're going to have wasted all that time creating the MPA and the pipeline and all those other great things. 3 minutes. Any questions so far? We can do a sidebar this afternoon. I'll be here.
Yeah.
I'll be here. Last thing, since I only have 3 minutes, and I sort of alluded to this a few times, right? One is the current administration policy, and the undersecretary mentioned this, right? Casting a broader net, bringing in more small businesses, increasing the goals. They've already increased the small disadvantaged 8A goal. They're going to be looking at hub zone, service disabled, and woman-owned because they don't want to pit one socio-category against the other. So they're going to look at that as well. When we see the infrastructure funds going out, there's a lot of funds for tribal entities, and there's a lot of grants for tribal governments for infrastructure as well as for communication and broadband. So I'd encourage you to look at all that. And then the last thing I'd say is that there has been, so these are all tailwinds, right? But there are headwinds. When we talk about getting into the federal marketplace, when you think about category management and setting up these vehicles that we just talked about that are so hard to get on, right? So more and more, because the federal government has goals to bring dollars under management, it means I'm going to take off this one standalone contract, and now I'm going to put it under this GWAC, which is OASIS or CIOSP4. They have goals to do that every year. So they're supposed to bring more dollars under management every year. When I was at the SBA, we used to battle that all the time. We thought it was the worst idea. And our administrator was really good. She supported us in that. This administration came out and said, you know what? Let's not have your small business goals be against your category management goals. If you set aside a requirement in one of the socio categories, 8A hub zone service disabled women owned, we'll allow it to count against your category management goals. So that's a huge step. Now that came out through a memo. You know, it's only as good as long as the president's there and the memo stands, but that's really positive for the socio category. So at least now we're not seeing a battle between small business set-asides and category management. But you should be aware of how the federal government is buying and what vehicles contracts are going under, and be aware on who the competition is and who your potential partners are. My time is up. Our next guest is here. Thank you and appreciate your attention.